While they may seem primitive now, the weapons of World War I completely revolutionized warfare. One of the biggest innovations during World War I was the use of poison gas. In fact, the widespread use of different poisons even had many calling the First World War the Chemists' War.
Poison gas is my personal favorite form of weaponry used in World War I. The Germans were the first to execute the use of chlorine gas. This would cause an extremely painful burning sensation in the chest and throat as it destroyed respiratory organs from the inside out. Mustard gas, however, was far worse. At least the respirator provided some defense against the chlorine gas. Mustard gas attacked the skin. Moist skin such as the eyes, armpits, and groin were very vulnerable. It burned its way into its victim, leaving searing blisters and unimaginable pain. This was extremely useful when there were large standoffs during trench warfare. Initially, gas cylinders were simply placed along the front lines facing enemy trenches. Once the wind was deemed favorable, the cylinders were opened and the gas floated with the breeze, carrying death to the enemy. Later, gas was packed into artillery shells and delivered behind enemy lines. No matter the method of delivery, its impact could produce absolute hell on Earth. By the end of the war, 1 in 4 of the artillery shells fired on the Western Front contained gas.
The machine gun was a very common weapon of choice during this war. They were used in standoffs while in trenches above warships, tanks, and aircraft. This weapon was originally created by the British Army, and they were given the credit for the development of it. It was used by all armies and positioned on a flat tripod, requiring a gun crew of 4 to 6 men. They could fire around 400 to 600 rounds per minute, and that number nearly doubled by the war's end. Advancements in this machine led to fabric or metal belts used to hold bullets, much like magazines today. That made the semi-automatic gun much more useful to those in control of it. The machine gun proved an impressive defensive weapon when it was established, especially to cover potential enemy attack groups. Artillery barrage could be heard for hundreds of miles. Along with exploding mines, it created immense noise. In 1917, explosives blowing up beneath the German lines of Messines Ridge at Yerpes in Belgium could be heard in London 140 miles away.
Machine guns were used by large powers, however, were only useful in stationary battles as they were larger and less mobile.
What was it like being up on the front? What did it look like?
Well, I'll tell you. There's bullets zipping around you all the time. You just never knew when you would get hit, but I was lucky. Another guy and I were sitting on bank, and the sniper shot him instead of me.
Were you sitting next to each other?
Yep, no more than 2 feet apart. The sniper picked him instead of me, and he was killed, of course.
Did they find the sniper?
Yeah, he was up in a tree and they killed him. They didn't take him prisoner. They killed him, shot him right out of the tree.
Did you come under artillery fire often?
All the time. We lived under it.
What was that like?
Well, after a while, you disregarded it. You didn't worry about it. You felt, if I get hit, I get hit. And if I don't, I don't. You just pay no attention to the shells dropping around you. You couldn't worry about it all the time, right?
Did you ever come under gas attack?
All the time. There was gas in all the shells practically. And yes, I was severely gassed several times. But I never went to medical for it. I just lost my voice. Eventually, it would come back.
So you were very lucky.
Yes, I was. Very.
So whenever artillery would come in and you would put your gas mask on?
That's right. After a while, yes, we were trained to put on the gas mask. I guess, as I remember, 6 seconds was the time it would take to put on the gas mask. And when the shells started coming over, you would use those 6 seconds to put the gas mask on. And after a while, you didn't bother to put the gas mask on. You smelled the gas. And if it wasn't severe, you didn't bother to put on the gas mask. And we lived with that.
Tanks were an amazing innovation to the war, especially during standoffs between trenches. They had the ability to make sharp turns at top speed, operate in reverse, climb hills, cross an 8-foot gap almost effortlessly, and was capable of holding, at most, 10 crew members, 2 machine guns, and a single 2-pound gun. The first machine was produced in secrecy and was believed to assist the Allies during the war. Landship tanks were the first to be used during battle. Tanks were initially called landships. However, in an attempt to disguise them as water storage tanks rather than weapons, the British decided to codename them tanks. The first prototype tank in World War I was Little Willie. Built in 1915, Willie carried a crew of 3 men and could travel as fast as 3 miles per hour. During World War I, British tanks were initially categorized into males and females. Male tanks had cannons, while females had heavy machine guns.
U-boats were used as a strategic form of warfare, and this war in specific was the first these machines were used and considered a serious weapon. Germany used these immensely to create blockades toward the British, who relied heavily on the seas for their food and supplies. The U-boats were used to attack merchant ships in unrestricted submarine warfare. The struggle between these two sides became known as the First Battle of the Atlantic. They had resorted to this unrestricted warfare because they were impractical for most other jobs. They were too crammed with machinery and could barely hold their own crew members, let alone any prisoners. After a brief pause of using these massive submarines as violent weapons, they started back up mercilessly and started not only take out merchant ships delivering to the enemy, but neutral, unimportant ships as well.
From the ground to the air, we see but eventually society all over the world. Looking out from aircraft, however, were strictly restricted so it would not stall when the plane turned quickly in the air. When a pilot restarted these machines which was very useful to certain countries during the war and left a heavy impact with their protection techniques. During the war, Germany used Zeppelins for military actions. Nature itself is designed to to reach or exceed the Zeppelin's altitude and introduction of fire-starting bullets turned the advantage to the defenders. By the end of the war, the Zeppelin had withdrawn from combat.
Flamethrowers were one of the most unique forms of weapons used in World War I. The British
Trench warfare was a form of warfare in which both combatants occupied motionless prepared fighting lines consisting largely of trenches, in which troops were mainly immune to enemy small arms fire and were considerably protected from artillery. It's become a good example for stalemating defense with a slow wearing down of opposing sides. A revolution in arms was ahead of similar advances in mobility, making the defense hold the advantage. Both sides constructed complex trenches and dugout systems opposing each other along a front, and protected themselves from assault by barbed wire. The area between opposing trench lines, no man's land, was fully exposed to small arms and artillery fire from both sides. During World War I, In these trenches, the greatest killer was disease. Sanitary conditions in the trenches were poor, and common infections included dysentery, typhus, and cholera. Many soldiers suffered from parasites and related infections. Limited hygiene also led to fungal conditions such as trench fever, which involved severe pain followed by high fever, and trench foot, which involved fungal infections by the feet caused by cold, wet, and unsanitary trench conditions. Exposure to harsh, cold weather conditions was also a common killer in these trenches. The dead were usually thrown into no man's land until the front line moved. Rats infested trenches also, and were known to grow the size of a cat supposedly. Lice eggs remained hidden in the seams of clothing, and within a few hours the clothing had been reworn, and the body heat generated would cause the eggs to hatch. Also, there was boredom, hunger, odor, coldness, darkness, etc. The Germans, after being defeated outside of Paris, retreated to the defensive positions and the trench warfare started. Trench warfare was a standard method of warfare during World War I and many wars to follow.